Picture the most watched finale in television history, a show so beloved that entire generations quote its characters without ever having watched a single episode. Now picture that same show quietly losing one lead actor after another, year after year, while somehow growing stronger every time. That is exactly what happened behind the camera of one of the greatest series ever made. And the reasons those actors walked away are far stranger, sadder, and more human than most fans ever realized. Some left chasing bigger dreams that never materialized. Some left because the role that made them famous was slowly breaking them. And one left in a way so sudden that the writers had to invent an entire cover story overnight. Stick around, because by the end of this video you'll understand why a show about a war fought 7 decades ago still has one of the most fascinating behind-the-scenes stories in Hollywood. Before we get into the departures themselves, it helps to understand what this show actually was, because that context explains almost everything that happened next. The series began life as a novel written by a former Korean War surgeon under a pen name, a book that mixed dark comedy with a blunt reality of battlefield medicine. That novel became a hit film in the early 70s, directed with a satirical edge that captured the era's growing unease about war. And 2 years after that, the concept was reborn as a television series that would run for 11 seasons, following the doctors and nurses of a mobile army surgical hospital during the Korean War. What made the show remarkable wasn't just the jokes. It was the willingness to sit inside genuine grief, exhaustion, and moral confusion, then find humor there without ever pretending the horror wasn't real. That tone shifted constantly as the show matured. And as it shifted, it left less and less room for some of the characters who had defined its earliest days. That tension between a show growing more serious and actors who had signed on for something lighter is the thread running through almost every major departure. It's also worth remembering just how unusual this show was for its time. It regularly used real archival war footage between scenes. It swapped out the traditional laugh track for the sound of helicopter blades. And it let its ensemble cast breathe and change in ways sitcoms of that era simply didn't attempt. Audiences weren't just watching jokes land. They were watching people slowly worn down by circumstance, which meant the actors playing those people were, in a strange way, being worn down right alongside them. That blurring of character and performer is part of what makes these departures so fascinating to look back on now. The first big exit remains one of the most talked about moments in American television, and it centers on the actor who played the unit's amiable, slightly bumbling, commanding officer. He was beloved from the very first episode, funny and warm in a way that gave the show an anchor of decency amid the chaos. He even won a Golden Globe for the role early in the series' run. But behind the scenes, he grew restless. As the show's creative direction increasingly centered on its lead star, the actor playing that officer felt his own part shrinking into a supporting role, and he wanted the chance to headline something of his own instead of playing second fiddle. So, at the end of a 3rd season, he told the producers he wouldn't be returning. What happened next became television history. Rather than writing him off gently, the way most sitcoms handled cast departures, the show's creators decided to use his exit to remind viewers what kind of story they were actually telling. In the season's final episode, his character is discharged and prepares for a joyful trip home, only for the audience to learn, in one devastating line delivered by a fellow cast member, that his plane went down over open water with no survivors. There was no music, no laugh track, just stunned silence in an operating room. It was one of the first times a network comedy had permanently killed off a major character without warning, and the reaction was immediate. CBS reportedly received a flood of mail, some praising the honesty of the choice, others furious that a character they loved had been taken from them so abruptly. As for the actor himself, his own career afterward didn't go the way he'd hoped. He signed on for a new sitcom built around his own name and persona, but it was canceled quickly, and a follow-up show fared even worse. Years later, in an interview, he admitted that leaving had essentially removed him from a once-in-a-lifetime show, and that audiences had loved the character far more than they'd loved him personally. He continued working in television afterward and remained fond of his old castmates, but he never found another role that resonated the way that one had. He passed away in 1996 at 68, and colleagues remembered him warmly as a kind and genuinely funny man who had helped define the show's earliest, gentlest years. What's especially poignant about his story is that, according to people who worked with him, he wasn't chasing fame for its own sake so much as trying to escape being permanently typecast as one specific character. A fear plenty of working actors understand, even if his particular exit ended up backfiring in ways he never expected. It's a reminder that leaving a hit show at its peak doesn't guarantee a bigger spotlight elsewhere. Sometimes it just means trading a role people loved for one nobody remembers. If that first departure was loud, the second one was almost the opposite: quiet, abrupt, and handled with none of the ceremony. The actor in question played the wisecracking surgeon who formed the show's original comedic double act alongside its lead star, the two of them trading banter and mischief that gave the early seasons their spark. But as the series went on, that balance shifted. The writers leaned harder into the lead character, giving him more depth, more screen time, and eventually the emotional center of the whole show, while this actor's character increasingly became a sounding board rather than an equal partner. He later explained that his frustration wasn't really about ego. It was about watching a once fully realized character get reduced to reacting to someone else's jokes instead of generating his own story. Rather than negotiating publicly or staging a dramatic exit, he simply chose not to return after the third season, and the producers reportedly didn't even know for certain that he was gone until shortly before the next season began filming. What made this exit especially unusual is that his contract had, by most accounts, never been formally signed, which meant that when the studio considered legal action over the surprise departure, there was little contractual ground to stand on. The show scrambled to explain his absence in the following season's premiere, simply noting that his character had been discharged while the story's lead was away. There was no farewell episode, no emotional send-off, just an empty space where a fan-favorite character used to be. He went on to have a modest continued acting career, but he found his true second act far from Hollywood, becoming a successful financial investor and eventually a recognizable face on business television discussing markets and economics. Despite the sudden and complicated way he left the show, there was reportedly no lasting animosity between him and his former castmates. When he passed away in 2015 at 82, the show's lead actor publicly remembered him as whip-smart, funny, and deeply missed. It's a strange footnote to a show about brotherhood and sacrifice that one of its original duos simply vanished from the narrative without so much as a goodbye scene. Yet in hindsight, that abrupt absence forced the writers to bring in a replacement character who would go on to become just as beloved, proving that even an unplanned departure could push the show forward rather than derail it. Not every departure was about ego or opportunity, though. One of the show's most memorable early antagonists, a pompous, rule-obsessed officer who served as the perfect comic foil for the show's rebellious leads, was played by an actor who simply felt the character had nowhere left to go. For 5 seasons, that character remained largely static while everyone around him deepened and evolved, and the actor playing him grew increasingly aware that the writers had no real plan to give him the same complexity. When his contract came up for renewal, he was offered an extension but turned it down, later explaining that he felt he had taken the role as far as it could go, and that continuing would mean repeating the same note season after season. He wasn't fired, and there was no dramatic falling out. He simply chose to move on, and the show explained his absence off-screen through a plot involving a reassignment overseas. His departure ended up reshaping the series in a meaningful way. With that one-note antagonist gone, the show no longer needed a cartoonish villain to generate conflict, and it was free to explore more nuanced moral tension instead. In many ways, fans and critics alike have pointed to this exit as a turning point that helped the show grow from merely good into something genuinely great. The actor continued working steadily in television and film afterward, though he never again found a role with quite the same cultural footprint. He passed away in 2000 at the age of 60, remembered as a skilled comedic performer who helped define an entire era of the show before quietly stepping aside so it could evolve. Unlike some of his castmates, there was no bitterness reported in his exit, no lawsuit, no scandal, just an actor who recognized that the character he'd spent 5 years perfecting had said everything he was ever going to say, and who was gracious enough to let the story move on without him. Perhaps the most emotionally complicated exit belongs to the actor who played the unit's endearing, teddy bear-carrying company clerk, a character with an almost supernatural ability to sense incoming danger before anyone else could. This actor was the only cast member to have appeared in both the original film and the television series, and he brought a gentleness to the role that made the character feel like the show's emotional conscience. But by the show's 7th season, the demands of the production were clearly taking a toll. He has since spoken candidly about experiencing serious burnout during those years, describing the exhausting cycle of feeling like he wasn't getting the recognition he deserved while simultaneously feeling increasingly disconnected from his own family life. Colleagues who worked closely with him on set have said he was also dealing with personal and marital strain during this period, all of which compounded the professional pressure. He has said in later interviews that being away from his children during their formative years was something he regretted deeply, and that stepping back was ultimately about reclaiming a life that had started to feel unrecognizable. Unlike the sudden, silent departures of some of his castmates, this actor's exit was given a proper send-off. A 2-part farewell episode in which his character learns that a family member back home has died, forcing him to confront the fact that his life at the hospital, however meaningful, was not the one he was meant to keep living forever. The episode ends on an almost wordless note, his character walking away alone, leaving his signature teddy bear behind. After leaving the show, he largely stepped back from the spotlight, eventually devoting himself to painting, wildlife conservation, and even a bit of quiet inventing, holding patents related to fishing equipment. He rarely gives interviews these days, but fans who do encounter him still describe him as gracious and reflective about the role that both made him famous and, by his own account, nearly wore him down. In more recent interviews, he's been candid about how disorienting it was to spend nearly a decade inhabiting a character so different from himself, an 18-year-old draftee played by a man approaching 30. And how that constant performance eventually demanded a kind of recovery that only stepping away from Hollywood entirely could provide. Then there's the actor who was brought in to fill the void left by that one-note antagonist we mentioned earlier, playing a cultured, arrogant, deeply private surgeon whose slow-burn character arc became one of the show's most sophisticated. Unlike almost every other major departure on this list, this actor didn't leave partway through the series. He stayed until the very end, and his character's final scene, quietly teaching a group of prisoners of war to appreciate classical music, remains one of the most understated and moving moments in the show's history. What makes his story worth including here isn't an early exit, but a later, very personal one. Years after the show ended, in 2009, he came out publicly as gay, explaining that he had spent much of his career staying silent out of genuine fear that being open about his identity could cost him work, particularly the family-friendly voice acting roles he'd built a career on after his time on the show. He described feeling proud to finally be honest about who he was, even later in life. He passed away in 2018 at 75 after a battle with bladder cancer, remembered not only for the dignity he brought to a complicated character, but for the quiet courage of living openly, even if it took decades to get there. His career after the show extended well beyond acting, too. He became an accomplished voice actor for major animated films, and later in life, he also worked as a conductor, guest leading orchestras around the world. A reminder that some of these actors' most interesting chapters were written long after they left the 4077th behind. It's worth pausing to recognize that while so many of the show's male leads came and went, one of its central actresses stayed for the entire 11-season run, one of only a handful of performers to appear in both the very first episode and the very last. She played the unit's strict, by-the-book head nurse, a character who began as something of a punchline built around an old nickname from the original film, but who, through steady insistence from the actress herself, grew into one of the most fully realized characters in the entire series. She has said in interviews that she was determined for the character to be taken seriously as a woman of substance, rather than remain a one-dimensional joke, and by the show's later seasons, that transformation was complete. while so many of her male co-stars left chasing bigger opportunities or escaping burnout. Her steady presence across all 11 seasons gave the ensemble a sense of continuity that helped hold the whole show together. She stuck around through the arrival of an entirely new commanding officer, the exit of her original on-screen love interest, and the introduction of several new characters. And by the finale, she was arguably the emotional through line connecting the show's chaotic first season to its far more contemplative last. It's a quieter kind of legacy than a shocking death scene or a mysterious disappearance, but it's just as important to the show's overall story. Looking back across all these departures, a clear pattern emerges. This wasn't a show plagued by scandal or bitter feuds. It was a show that kept evolving, sometimes faster than certain characters or the actors playing them could keep up with. Some left chasing stardom that never quite arrived. Some left because a role that once felt exciting had become suffocating. One left because a character simply ran out of places to grow. And through every single one of those exits, the series somehow kept finding new ways to tell its story, using each departure not as a wound, but as an opportunity to deepen what the show was really about. The strange, aching mixture of humor and grief that comes from trying to hold onto your humanity in the middle of a war. That's a big part of why, decades later, people are still talking about who left, why they left, and what the show became because of it. Consider how differently things might have gone had any single one of these actors stayed. Would the show have ever taken the risk of killing off a beloved commanding officer if that actor hadn't wanted out first? Would audiences have gotten one of television's most nuanced antagonists if the original one hadn't grown bored of his own character? It's easy to look at a long-running show and assume its greatness was inevitable, but the truth is messier and more interesting than that. Almost every turning point in this show's 11-year run was, in some way, forced into existence by an actor's personal decision to walk away, whether out of ambition, exhaustion, heartbreak, or simply the sense that a chapter had closed. And each time, instead of collapsing under the loss, the show found a way to turn that absence into its next great storyline. That's a rare kind of resilience for any television series, and it's part of what has kept people rewatching these episodes for over 50 years. If you enjoyed learning the real stories behind these departures, let us know which one surprised you the most in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the shows that shaped television history.